Good morning, everybody, and a huge thank you for joining this AFME members and friends event. We are going to be focusing on well-being and mental health, reflecting a little bit on lockdown and our return to work. And you've got a fantastic panel of speakers today to address that. We're working in quite compressed time. We're very sensitive and aware this is a very busy time for all our capital markets, wholesale markets. We have a wide audience here, so a huge thank you all for joining us. The timing of this has been designed to coincide and raise awareness to stimulate two things. One, awareness that next week is Mental Health Awareness Week, and so an ask for each of you is to go back into your organizations and raise awareness of that and see how your organization is prepared to participate. And as we reflect on the return to work, every organization with more than 50 people is going to be undertaking a health and safety risk assessment. And so perhaps there's no better time to include within the health subject the well-being and mental health of all the employees in the capital markets. So a huge thank you to City Mental Health Alliance and UK Finance, who have been very supportive of this event that AFME is putting on, and we'll be feeding a lot of the material we talk about in this event to you in an email afterwards. And if you'd like to share the email or some of the learnings, there will be a recording of this, so you don't need to scribble down notes and everything. So please give this wonderful group of speakers all of your attention. Thank you again for joining. We have Dr. John Finn, who is the founder and managing director of Tougher Minds and the Me Power Academy. He's a very distinguished writer and thinker on this subject. You can find his biography on the website, and he's very happy to receive any of your thoughts, questions, connections after this event. We have Nigel Jones, who's an executive coach, wellbeing consultant, but also the chairman of the City Mental Health Alliance advisory group, and having been the recent past chairman of the City Mental Health Alliance. He is a scientist by education, but also a very distinguished Linklaters, former Linklaters lawyer, and he has a passion for health and in particular well-being. And we also have Paul Barrett, who is the head of Wellbeing at the Bank Workers Charity. So let's get right into our event today. Keep your questions coming, please. And if we can go to John first, Dr. John Finn, some thoughts about what do we think the impact, positive and negative, of social isolation and lockdown has been on the mental health of employees?
Understand the impact, we need to understand how brains work and draw on the best neuroscience, behavioural science and psychology that we understand. And to understand this, I'm going to show how you can make a mini model of your brain using either your left or your right hand. So if you put your palm like this, and if you put your thumb into the middle of your palm like this, and if you wrap your fingers around your thumb like this, just orientate your fist like that, this is a mini model of your brain. Now, the thumb in the middle of your hand, it represents the limbic regions of the brain. And the little finger is representing the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that runs behind the eyes all the way to the top of the forehead. Now, what we need to understand is that the vast majority of things we are doing is being run by the thumb, the limbic regions. And we would estimate that at least 98% of our behaviour, how we think and what we do at any given time, is mindless. So the preeminent professor, George Lakoff, would say that for every 50 things your brain is doing right now, you're only conscious of one. And lots of our habits are helpful for us being healthy, happy and at our best. But lots of our habits are unhelpful. And what we need to recognize is that our brain has been evolving for over 200,000 years, and we've evolved to prioritize survival and saving energy. So any well-being challenges that we have, any performance challenges that we have during this lockdown period, but also before and after it, are always connected to unhelpful habits. So we run on habits. What are the kind of things that we need to get right if we're going to be at our best during the lockdown period? 3 broad things to pay attention to. Number 1 is we've got to look after the brain, and that means getting our sleep right, our diet right, and our exercise right. We need to do that because there's a very special site in our brain called the hippocampus, or the hippocampi. There's one in each hemisphere. That is the only site in the brain that we understand produces new brain cells. And if you want to be good at managing stress, thinking clearly, learning and adapting to the new technologies that we need to use, we need lots of new brain cells. The sleep, diet and exercise make that area of the brain work properly, as also the prefrontal cortex, which we need for clever thinking. And then the 2 other things we need to get a balance of are hedonism, that is having fun, having pleasure, giving into short-term gratification, but balancing that out with eudaimonia, that is making personal progress. But getting to the end of the day feeling like you've achieved something, getting to the end of the week feeling like you've achieved something, got some results, both individually and collectively. And I think ultimately the impact of the lockdown is that it's much more challenging to get your habits aligned to good sleep, good diet, good exercise, balancing both short-term gratification, but also persisting when you need to. So that's the way that I would view it, Michael, in the first instance.
Excellent. A huge thank you, Dr. John. Important tips. Nigel, this has been a profoundly human crisis, as a health crisis, and a little bit of a financial bubble at the beginning, and we're having a liquidity crisis, a solvency crisis. But Nigel, some thoughts and reflections. Spend a lot of time with leaders, organizations and businesses, and some thoughts from the top.
Well, Michael, thank you for that introduction. You mentioned my science background. I'm not as well trained or as visually adept as John at giving you an image there. So my answer is based more on my 32 years at Linklaters than my 4 years as a biochemist much earlier in my life, and particularly on conversations I've had with others involved in health and well-being, including senior leaders of organisations who have been members of City Mental Health Alliance since the early days of our conversations, which led to its creation, and that's more than 10 years ago now. And I've been particularly pleased to be involved in many of those conversations as they have increased in frequency over the last few months. So my answer is based not on my personal experience, but more on what I'm picking up from that experience over quite a long period. And I think there are 3 key points that I think, so to your point about positives and negatives, there are many people who are saying my mental health has improved through this. They're not in the majority, and the studies are varied, but people who are getting more sleep, to pick up on John's speak, people who are able to have a more regular exercise routine. And I go for a walk first thing in the morning with my wife every day, which we didn't used to do, and that helps. People who are able to fit in other things to their routine, which they find helpful. I spend half an hour practicing my piano, things that people wanted to do before, which they can now fit in. Of course, for many, many other people, things are very different, and the sorts of challenges people are facing is losing track of time, not having any boundaries. They wake up in their bed, they switch on their laptop, they hopefully put something other than their pajamas on, and that's where they work all day, and they carry on working later. So presenteeism becomes an increased problem, as it has been in the city for a long time. And I think 3 key messages I used to give before this started, I'm giving now, and I think I will continue to give from our experience with City Mental Health Alliance as far as leaders are concerned. First, if you want your wellbeing initiative to work, you have to lead it personally in your words and actions. Secondly, the power of stories, such as the one, Michael, you kindly and bravely shared with other City Mental Health Alliance leaders 4 or 5 years ago. about your own experiences of challenging times mentally, how you overcame them, how your organisation supported it, the challenges you faced. So the power of stories. And thirdly, collaboration rather than competition, both internally, giving permission to different peer groups within your organisation to work together rather than being told what to do by you. Having conversations facilitated by the City Mental Health Alliance or other organisations, AFME, CISI, but talk to your peers, find out what's going on, and be open and honest in those conversations, both internally and externally. Nobody knows what the right answers are in this situation because we've never been here before. Some things will work for some people, some things won't. If leaders lead from the top, tell their personal stories, and collaborate with other people, I think we'll all come out of this in a much healthier way.
Thank you, Nigel. Some compelling insights there, and perhaps we'll return to some of those. Paul, the Bank Workers Charity has been already doing working on a number of initiatives for some of the banks, and I know you have some reflections. Perhaps you have some recent survey data from some of the organisations and what other organisations are doing to help their employees. Paul.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much. I think what I'll do, if you don't mind, if I can go through some of the things that we're seeing in the business community at large, and then focus on some examples of things which I think represent really good practice in the way businesses are responding to employee wellbeing needs. But you mentioned data that's out there. I mean, I read a very interesting piece in the World Economic Forum website that suggested that the current situation represents the biggest psychological experiment in human history. And not surprisingly, I tend to agree with that. What we're seeing is an incredible amount of research. People like psychologists, researchers, the various think tanks, the Institute of Employment Studies, the Resolution Foundation, have been very quick off the mark to look at the impact of the social lockdown at lots of different levels. And I think there's been some really useful things come from that. There's been research into mental health, as Nigel has already referred to, but there's been research into people's financial well-being, a massive impact anyway on their mental health. There's been research into sleep and the way that has been affected. And we're getting lots of good insights that are useful to organisations in thinking about what measures and steps they need to take to support their staff. Now, I absolutely agree there are people out there who are experiencing many benefits from the lockdown and the situation we find ourselves in at so many levels, from the being able to catch up on things, many of the things that Nigel mentioned just now, the benefits of not having draining commutes, all of that on the plus side. And I think the interesting thing about the research is where it highlights the things that we really need to think more about. And what it's saying is there are significant numbers of people who are suffering much worse sleep. They're getting more sleep, interestingly. Most people are getting about an hour extra per day, but the quality of sleep is much worse. It's more disrupted, it's fragmented. 75% of people in the UK, and this was figures at the end of April, it's probably worse now, 75% of us have reduced income, and that has a knock-on effect for well-being. So there are lots of useful insights that businesses are using to target their various well-being interventions. And I think businesses have risen to the challenge very well. What we're seeing is steps to address things like social well-being. Something on the well-being agenda, more generally, social well-being has been the junior partner in comparison with mental health, physical well-being, and financial well-being. But I think there's been a realization that businesses have had to do something to replace the social dimension of work, which is critically important. There's been much research into home working that's found loneliness is a big factor for people that work regularly from home. So it's been great to see companies putting in using things like Zoom and other platforms to have quizzes, to celebrate birthdays, to have coffee mornings and so on, that helps to restore some of that camaraderie. And they're creating time that is not work. It's not about work. These are things that are allowing people to connect in the social way that work has always allowed people. There are, I think, some really important things happening practically. If people are working from home, they need to know that they've got the right equipment. They need to know they're trusted by their employers to work effectively. And I think we are seeing all of that, which again is all to the good. Most businesses of any size have created wellbeing hubs, acknowledging that people are having to dip in remotely, but are able to access lots of good materials that support their health and wellbeing. So that's some general things that we're seeing in the wider business community. As far as the banks are concerned, banks have always placed a great premium on supporting wellbeing. And in fact, my charity, along with the mental health charity Mind, created a line manager training in understanding and responding to mental health at work. And this was in 2015. We approached 4 banks to run a pilot. And I think it was a measure of their openness to addressing mental health way back then, when few organisations were very strongly focused on that. All 4 banks, the Bank of England, Barclays, TSB and Lloyds, all ran the pilot. And I think they've built very successfully from there. They've all got wellbeing strategies in place, or it's very few banks that don't. And that's given them a really strong foundation for moving forward into the situation that we're in now as we approach COVID. So like many organisations, they have the wellbeing microsites that allow people to manage their wellbeing remotely. Some are making apps like Headspace available, calming apps and so on, recognising that some staff are struggling with anxiety. One bank has a fantastic team of people that are entirely focused on financial wellbeing, recognising that they have many colleagues who have husbands and wives that are self-employed and not working or on furlough, that they need extra support at this difficult time. So they're offering guidance on budgeting, on maximising their income, and it's been a massively appreciated and effective initiative. I think in general, the banks have good wellbeing teams that are working in very innovative ways. They're responding to the changes of the crisis. For example, we've been asked to create COVID-specific webinars. And I know they're not just asking organisations like the bank charity, but we've been asked to do them on things like financial wellbeing, like the importance of sleep and taking breaks. Lots of really key messages. We're approached by one bank to do one on understanding grief. And they have already anticipated that you're going to have large numbers of staff who will be affected one way or another. And they want their people to have enough understanding of grief to be able to support colleagues, and obviously for managers, that level of understanding is important too. So I think what we're seeing is them not just delivering business as usual wellbeing, they're taking a really specific focus on the kinds of issues employees are facing right now. And I think that will continue to happen because they're fortunate. Most banks are big enough to have those significant wellbeing teams to be able to really respond to new needs as they emerge. So they're some of the things that we've been seeing.
Thank you, Paul. And that comment about grief, absolutely vital. Do you know in your team who's been impacted? We know, I think, that when somebody dies, studies suggest that 6 people at least suffer very intense grief. And that's amplified in these times where there's been an inability to arrange funerals, memorials, say goodbye properly, and have that level of closure. So thank you for those excellent points, Paul, really appreciated. Communication through this period with your teams, your employees, and also with your regulators has been critical. Nigel, I know you've reflected on communication quite a lot. Some thoughts on communication during these times?
Yes, Michael, and again, reflecting on the COVID-specific nature of many of the messages that we're all listening to and sharing has made me think back to the early days of my role as health and wellbeing partner at Linklaters that hadn't been one before, and I don't think that such role had existed in any law firm 10 years ago. And when I started to have conversations with people, one of the people I really wanted to hear from was our in-house occupational health nurse. And when I was preparing for a partner gathering, which was going to deal with mental health, which was quite a frightening experience because it had never been done before, and there were quite a lot of people who didn't think that was an appropriate thing for a partner conference at the time to be talking about. Of course, things have changed since. I asked her, and without any hesitation, my question was, what can senior people do more to improve the well-being of our people? And she said, listen more. And those words have always stuck with me, and I think are incredibly important now when we're thinking about communication. There is a huge amount of top-down communication. Many leaders thinking they need to communicate more, which means appearing on this sort of thing, doing videos, sending messages to everybody in the firm with whatever the reassuring or other message may be. And those are important. And it's reflected in the first of the points I made earlier, which is that in relation to wellbeing, the initiative has got to be led actively and in words and actions by the leader. In addition to that, leaders need to switch off the send button and switch on the receive button. Listen to what people are hearing. Find out whether somebody in their group may have suffered a bereavement. Then adapt the offering that's provided to that particular person or that group accordingly. Giving bereavement sessions, compulsory bereavement sessions for everybody is probably not going to work terribly well. Offering it and allowing people to participate when they want to, whether in advance of a bereavement or while they're dealing with one, I think is far more likely to be acceptable. So to work rather, but listening rather than telling. And in order to build that two-way trust, as I've said before, being honest, I'm finding this difficult, not going on about the fact that particular experiences you're having, which you're finding difficult. You're unlikely to get a huge amount of sympathy if you are living in a 10-bedroom mansion and your problem is Wi-Fi. But if many of your people are suffering far worse, but at least being open and honest in the way you communicate. The frequency or cadence of communications was something that we picked up very early on through communications with City Mental Health Alliance members. And there was a huge amount of material dumped on us all very early on in this. The organisations which I think reflected a bit more carefully thought, well, actually, if we give everything at the beginning in the first week, what are we going to do in week 3, let alone what are we going to do in month 3, or potentially in relation to mental health, year 3? What are we all going to be doing once the peak of COVID may have gone, and possibly even after a vaccine? The mental health issues are not suddenly going to evaporate. So cadence of communication, clarity, consistency, honesty, authenticity, I think are absolutely critical. And as I said before, then encouraging people to communicate with each other, giving people permission to have their own quiz nights or whatever it is, but also adapting quickly, not one size fits all. So one firm banned the use of any external platform previously for security reasons. They've had to change that and make people have access to the one we're using today, to all the others that are being mentioned. And adapting your HR policies, and also focusing. Different people are experiencing this in different ways. If you like categories, it's the people who are homeschooling, there are people who have caring responsibilities, there are people who are living alone, there are people who have prior mental health conditions. Adapt your messaging to reflect the fact that everybody has different experiences. So those would be some of the thoughts I would share today.
Thank you, Nigel. Super helpful. Dr. John, both you and Paul, and I know Nigel's got it as well, have been modelling liquidity for this group of capital markets professionals and regulators. The importance of drinking water, I know, is critical. But John, how are we helping support colleagues at this time? We're going through imminently another transition. We've gone from a place of work to remote working. Productivity may have increased in many organisations. We're going slowly back into work as childcare and transportation, mass transportation, and all the other forms of transportation we're encouraged to consider. We want to be super productive on our return. We've been running on adrenaline through this period. Your advice and thoughts about how we make this transition?
Sure. So if we go back to the habit idea and the limbic regions of the brain, what we understand is that our brain prioritizes three core things. One is to stay alive, and we saw how the supermarket shelves quickly emptied when this lockdown began. Two is how we're perceived by other people. Social status has been essential for our evolution, our survival, and doing well. And the third one is conservation of energy. So that's APE. So we call the limbic regions the ape brain. And it's the dominant force in all our lives. And in order to manage it, we have to be very deliberate, and we have to deliberately choose to work towards being at our best. And we have to empower people and help people to learn how to do that. We call this me power conditioning. And part of the work that we've been doing with our clients in the city over this challenging period is working from home programs, working from home for well-being, for productivity and success. And we distilled that down into 10 rules for people to follow. And obviously, one of the core ideas is exercise. And I'm on my workstation treadmill at the moment. I've just set that going. I'm going to do some exercise as I'm doing this next piece. So the first rule that we've been helping people to understand, I'm doing about 2.4 miles an hour at the moment. The first rule is teaching people how to deliberately build new helpful habits. That is understanding how to manage their brain, but also their environment and what behavioral science tells us. The second rule is about using goals to boost motivation, connecting our long-term goals with compelling us why we don't need to eat that extra chocolate biscuit this afternoon, and connecting all those things together. Rule number 3 was about watching ourselves more, being more aware and deliberately analysing our helpful and our unhelpful habits so that we can refine some of our more unhelpful habits. We've been teaching people how to work hard on their sleep so they can get better sleep quality and duration. Teaching people how to build exercising at home when we could only go out once a day, because we know that's so key for brain function. And everybody could get the treadmill workstation, but there are other things people have been doing. Educating people about how the food they eat impacts on brain function and mental health and productivity, etc. Teaching people the importance of planning ahead, so creating what we call willpower stories. Our best weapon against the ape brain is to plan ahead. Showing people how to concentrate, so sequentially, drawing lessons from people like Johnny Wilkinson and Serena Williams, showing how we can actually block out some of the challenges of the attention economy so we can do a 5-minute job in 5 minutes and not 10 minutes and be half an hour down by the end of the morning and an hour down by the end of the day. Teaching people how to actually switch off properly, recharge, tame the brain so that we can secure that really good non-sleep recharge. And also showing people how they can draw a line at the end of the day, writing to reframe and relax so you can shut off, rest and go again. So it really is empowering people to learn how to build new habits so that they can be at their best more often, both in the current context. But you know, the challenge is that we live in the VUCA world, and the only constant in our world is change. So we have to become better and better at refining our behaviours so that they are more helpful for our health, our happiness and our performance. So that's some of the things that we've been doing. And after the webinar, we're going to send out, I think, some of those resources so people can see those ideas in much more detail.
Brilliant, John. And of course, everyone wants to know what is the little treadmill you're walking on, how it's integrated into your work environment, and keep going. We might even be sponsoring you to keep going. So keep going. We're loving that. The movement and agility of the capital markets is reflected in your presentation. So I know all the members and friends and colleagues who are watching this will truly appreciate that. Once lockdown is over and everybody is working on their plans for restart, we're going to have red teams and blue teams and different cohorts staging ways back into offices and places of work. But maybe things have profoundly changed. They're going to be the furloughed colleagues who are wondering, will I ever get back into that workplace? Once lockdown is over, Paul, I know you've thought deeply about what are going to be the biggest concerns. We've had senior industry executives musing on the future of the office and the necessity for the office. Some thoughts, Paul?
Yeah. Well, I think a couple of things. In the immediate term, it's almost inevitable that businesses are going to have to focus on how they can persuade their returning staff that the workplace environment is a safe place to return to. I think that's an immediate and massive priority. It's reflected. Our charity's already been approached by one of the big banks to say, can we do a webinar on returner anxiety? And I think that's reflective of what we're seeing in opinion poll after opinion poll, whichever one you believe. It's between 65% of us, 75% of us, and it's sometimes more than that, of people that don't feel the work environment is a safe and ready place to return to. So businesses have some way to go in making it so, and also persuading people that when they do come back, they're going to be safe. I think there are steps that they can take to address that. They can. It's almost certainly going to be a graduated return for almost everybody. And certainly, if you think of the big corporate buildings at Canary Wharf, there's no way you can suddenly flood those buildings with the relatively low number of lifts they have in those buildings to accommodate and transport thousands of people. So it's going to be a graduated return. As long as they get it right, they can use the people that return to send out a signal to colleagues who are yet to come back that actually it's working and it is safe. But businesses do have to get it right. So they've got to be, you're talking about immediate concerns for employees. I think that's a very significant one, but it's also a significant one for business. I think longer term, you touched on it. I think the genie's out of the bottle on home working. I think there were many organizations and managers within organizations that regarded home working with some skepticism. I think the research has always told us that people can work from home just as productively as they can in the office. But I think it's nevertheless been an obstacle to overcome in the minds of some people. I think that's gone. I think the evidence is that people are working highly effectively from home. And interestingly, I think Nigel referred to this just now. You may have seen a BBC piece with Jez Slaley from Barclays, who was saying they're reviewing their location strategy. And it's probable that the days are gone of huge corporate edifices housing thousands of people. Those grand offices, he was suggesting, may well be on the way out. 7,000 people operating in one building. What something like a pandemic does is show what the risks are attached to that. And why would you pay those massive costs as a business if it can be done just as effectively from home? And your employees get the benefit of all of the things that we've touched on earlier. Yes, it has been stressful for some people if they've got confinement with young children that they're having to homeschool, or they've got elder care parents. But if and when we return to normal, it will be much better and will be much easier for people to realize the real benefits of working from home, the work-life balance, the lack of the commute. And I think finally, one really important thing that we've been seeing is how crucial the role of the line manager is around mental health. In the Institute of Employment Studies showed that where people had regular contact with their line manager, they were far less likely to be struggling with mental health issues. And I think line managers are checking in much more with their staff to see how they are, obviously in part in readiness for a return, but generally those well-being conversations are actually happening in a way that they probably never have before. So what I would hope is that well-being conversations, because they can be so supportive of good mental health, will become a feature of the new world when we finally move into it. But there are some general observations, I guess.
Thank you, Paul. That's fantastic. And your mention of Barclays, I always try and call them out because they have given all of us the This Is Me campaign, and it's foundational to the Mental Health Awareness Week. If I'm looking distracted, it's only because I'm encouraged to look at another link to get all the wonderful questions that are coming in. And while I'm just reviewing your questions, because we are going to get to them in quick fire, I just know that Dr. John has a few top tips you as well to think about, he'd mentioned habits, he'd mentioned thoughts about how best to think about that return to work and embedding those habits. Dr. John, back to you.
Yes, Michael, well, the previous question you asked is, what is the new normal? What's it going to look like? The reality is that we now live in the VUCA world. We live in the attention economy. We're entering the fourth industrial revolution. The only constant in that world is change, and the change is getting faster and faster and faster. That is the new normal. And therefore, the fundamental skills that are going to allow people to thrive in this VUCA world is the ability to be resilient. And actually, resilience is an outcome. What sits underneath being resilient is being really good at regulating your emotions, resisting the temptation not to do the unhelpful thing, even though it's easier to do. My PhD was in emotional regulation in difficult transitions for high-performing people. It explains an awful lot when you get good at regulating your emotions. And we can teach people, it's a learnable skill, we can teach people how to get better at it. And we can learn how to regulate our emotions so we can get better at being resilient and building more small, new, helpful habits that allow us to adapt to the new circumstances. And we call this a purposeful development mindset. And there are some organizations that have made teaching their people to make daily adjustments to get better and better and better as the heart of their organization. People like Bridgewater Associates, and those type of companies we would call purposeful development organizations. They are beating the competitors hands down. They are getting all the outcomes that we are pursuing, from better sleep, better diet, better exercise, greater well-being, enhanced resilience, reduced stress, improved confidence, more creativity and innovation, better productivity, better transformational leaders, happier people, truly high-performing teams, successful change management. And it all comes back to teaching their people about how their brain works and empowering them to build these small, new, helpful habits via emotional regulation. Because well-being and mental health are completely connected to performance. You know, if we're not performing, it's going to be harder to feel well. So I think that's the new reality, is that the VUCA world means the only constant is change. The current crisis is just one example of that. And this change will keep coming and it will keep speeding things up. And the best way that we can help our people to manage that from on a well-being and performance level is empower them to have purposeful development mindsets. And that is to build small, new, helpful habits, to be resilient, all through the vehicle of having better emotional regulation.
Dr. John, you're talking to this audience about regulation and they love it. Our regulators have given us much support, much forbearance, and you've now introduced emotional regulation as well, so fantastic. You've also introduced the concept of purposeful mindsets and purposeful leadership, and I think that's, you don't know how on the money you are with those comments. Couple of questions coming in, and these are getting lots of likes, so I'm going to focus on these two. Feels like presenteeism has crept in similar ways as it used to be in the office. Many of us spend days sitting in front of computers on client calls, training, team meetings, etc. during normal working hours. Some senior people keep sending emails into evenings and early mornings. How can we resist this pressure? And that has had 7 likes. And the other to respond to is any tips on how to deal with anxiety. Sometimes it's hard to take a sick day, for that as many organizations, managers don't understand mental health, even though they say they do. Those are the 2 most popular questions coming in. So Nigel, perhaps a reflection on presenteeism and how to manage, and then Paul and John, perhaps some reflections on anxiety.
Excellent questions. And I touched on presenteeism earlier. I think I was leading a session last week for a public sector group of lawyers who are having to meet the dramatically increased demands on their workload as a result of the speed and number of new initiatives the government is having to make. And that public sector role, many in the city would say, oh, well, that's relatively easy. That's 9 to 5. People leave the city to go and have an easier life in a public sector role. Well, I don't think that's ever been true, and it's certainly not true now. And they were making 2 points which I think are relevant here. One is we find it very difficult to create boundaries, and so one of the ways of addressing that is picking up on what I and others have said, is try to identify a regular schedule, a habit, a series of habits which you are able to fit into your day around homeschooling, around caring or whatever, so that you're getting up at the same time every day, going to bed at the same time every day, which John can comment on whether that helps or not with sleep, regular habits, when you do your exercise, how you do it, try to build those in and limit the amount of 10 minutes you have to do jobs that should only last 5 minutes. Secondly, I think the point I made earlier about leaders being clear, be clear with your people what it is that is valuable to your organization, and try to discourage them from thinking that spending a long time on these sort of calls and saying lots of things and saying sort of dominating these calls is the way to get recognition from them. Productivity, efficiency is what we want, not long hours. And I, as the leader, recognize for me that the only way I can be efficient and effective and help our organization thrive is by being well myself. And this is what I do. So encouraging people that on presenteeism, I think on the point of resilience, building resilience is really important. But one of the things that we often get pushback from is, why do I have to change the way I am? Why don't you, the organization, change the way you are? And I think that is it's not one or the other, but I do think there is a risk, and it's a trap I've fallen into before, when commenting, as John has really helpfully done, on how we can all become more resilient, which is really helpful. People say, well, you're asking me to become more able to cope with a long hours culture when you're telling me that a long hours culture is not helpful. So why don't you change your long hours culture and help me as well? So I think that's just another point. And to the purpose point, another thing which I think is relevant to presenteeism is and create a purpose, because if people have a purpose, if they have something in addition to their day job to do, they're likely to feel better. If they think that their organization has a purpose that is worthwhile. And in that context, I'm involved in various initiatives which are looking at ways in which the charitable sector can work more closely with the private sector, not by the private sector giving money, but by the private sector where it has resource which it's not currently utilizing. They've had to furlough people with fantastic IT skills, project management skills, and so on, engaging, helping those people have a purpose, have something to get up for every day, even though they can't work for the organization, and contribute to whatever the charitable cause is. And the flip side of that, and I'll end there, is for organizations that are in the position that many on this call are, that they have their own EAPs, they have their own access and funds to pay for things like bereavement, mental health, anxiety, don't signpost your people to the charities who provide that support. By all means, signpost them to the websites that have the information, but don't encourage them to use your own EAPs, your own helplines that you're paying for. Don't take away resource from those charities, which others in society, I would say, need far more than you do.
Thank you, Nigel, for that. An acronym crept in, EAP, Emergency Assistance Program.
Or Employee Assistance Program.
Thank you for that. Or Employee Assistance Program. Another question has come in, and maybe, Paul, you'll take this one in the context of some of the work you've been doing. What are your personal opinions on allowing employees more flexible working conditions on the back of lockdown? Is this likely to improve mental health during the transition back to normal, inverted commas, work life?
I think absolutely it is. And I think it's one of the potential great benefits that we get here, that businesses have had to make lots of accommodations to people's personal circumstances to get the best out of them. So what we're seeing is people shifting their working day to accommodate things like caring needs, childcare issues, and they're proving that it is making a difference in terms of their productivity. It's not a loss to the business. They're proving that they can be extremely effective working like that. And I think having done so, there will be a lot of people will expect that ground not to be lost when they return to work. But I think equally, businesses will have seen that happen, that there isn't a trade-off involved here, that there are both the business benefit and the benefit for the employees. So I fully expect flexible working to be a significant part, as I also expect home working to be, of the new world as we move into it. I think they're two genuine positives that could make a big difference to people's work-life balance in the future.
Thank you, Paul. And the final word going to Dr. John. We're mindful and respectful of your time, both listening in as members and friends to this, but also our presenters. Top tips on dealing with anxiety. John.
Sure, yeah. So we have to control what we can control ultimately in the first instance. Helps to understand what is the root cause of being anxious. So anxiety occurs because of a series of stress responses. So if things are stressful, any one thing is stressful because what you expected to happen doesn't happen. That could be as simple as I held the door open for somebody. Or better example, I expect people to stay 2 meters away from me currently, and they're getting a little bit close. That becomes a little bit stressful. Equally, it could be I didn't get the pay rise that I wanted this year. This is just a disconnection between your meaning systems. What happens in the brain then is you get this fight or flight response, which is a very complex reaction in your HPA axis, releases lots of chemicals and neurotransmitters. The core thing that you can be interested in on a personal level with the fight and flight response is you start to breathe faster. Happens in milliseconds. So you've got to, first of all, slow down the breathing deliberately to reverse the fight or flight response. So what I would do, well, I could be on my treadmill now, and as I'm walking along, I'm just going to focus on breathing in for 5 seconds, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and breathing out for 5 seconds, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then once I've got that rhythm, what I can start to do is, because the second part of the stress response is your brain goes to the threat, the unhelpful thing, is you can start to write down to reframe. Because our prefrontal cortex is not very powerful, and the ape brain is going to keep winning the argument against why this is a problem. When you start to write things down, you extend the power of your thinking. Prefrontal cortex can only hold 5 to 7 bits of information at any one time for only about 7 seconds. And when you write things down, obviously things don't disappear like that. So writing down is a really great way to reframe and manage anxiety. But the foundations of this are getting your sleep right, your diet right, and your exercise right. And you know, if perfect sleep is a 10 out of 10 and no sleep is a 0, you just got to work out where you are right now on the continuum. Well, I'm a 1. If you're at a 1, you're not going to get to 10 by the end of the week. You need to aim to get to a 1.5 and build up one tiny step at a time. The same with your exercise. Can you do 5 more minutes walking today? Can you eat 1 more piece of fruit today? Swap it for a chocolate biscuit. And it's all about building the habits of how you respond to that. One of the things that we give people is our performance planners, Wellbeing and Performance Planner. This is a habit building tool where every day you plan, and you might be working on an anxiety habit, for example. You know, if you plan, what you're going to do, you reflect, you're going to get better. You're going to change your brain to build better habits. So all these things are manageable. And I think talking to Paul's point about the flexible working, yeah, I think that can be really powerful. But what we're seeing, we work with a lot of companies that have gone to 4 days a week. If you don't give your people the right support and training in order to build habits that are really helpful for them when they're working from home, flexible working doesn't work very well, is what we're seeing. So you've got to couple the environment that you can work flexibly with the right knowledge and skills to build the right habits. And now is a great opportunity to do that, I think. So hopefully that's helpful, Michael.
Brilliant, John. Thank you for that. Thank you, everybody, for listening. We're not going to raise your anxiety anymore by keeping this going. We're already a few minutes over. I think there's some inspiring words you've heard from our panelists. Dr. John, don't risk it for a chocolate biscuit. I think that's marvellous. Her Majesty gave us, don't give up, don't despair, we will meet again. And I would just end by saying, stay positive, test negative. If this has been a useful event, do give great feedback back to the AFME team, and we'll do it again. We'll provide all the materials mentioned. Thank you very much indeed. It's been a great event, and a huge virtual thank you from all of us to our panelists.
Bye.